Chapter 10 is all about intelligence and the theories that shape intelligence. So throughout this little recording, I'm going to talk about the theories and try to break them down so that you can understand their functions. I'm also going to mention some key terms that I think you definitely should know for this test. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with the theory of general intelligence. This theory was created by Charles Spearman, and it's the belief that we have one general intelligence that underlies all of our specific mental abilities. Spearman liked to refer to this as the G factor. And it's basically saying that we're smart in one area, but we're skilled in other areas. So he believes that basically our source comes from one main specific area that we're smart in. And in order to test this, Spearman created a procedure called the factor analysis. Now, the factor analysis is a statistical procedure that identifies clusters of related items on a test. So, for an example, when you're trying to use factor analysis, you're going to basically be testing all of your different abilities. And the factor analysis is going to give your ability factor a number or a score. And once the score is given to that factor, it's going to be categorized into a box with all the other abilities that score that same number. So let's say that I'm testing my ability to perform as an athlete, to play an instrument, and to do well in school. If all three of those factors are similar in score, they're going to go in the same box and be clustered together. And with this theory, you have to mention spatial numerical reasoning because this is the act of figuring out how those clusters of factors work together. Spearman used this to try to figure out what the G factor is, like what is the general intelligence. And his results came up a little short because he didn't have enough evidence to support his original idea. Most of the scores were dependent on one another. And also they said that if the person did well in a certain area, it was more likely that they would do well in another area. So there was no way to really just pinpoint one specific G factor. And this brings me to the issue with this theory. The theory the theory forced people to ask the question, can one factor really explain all human abilities? And since Spearman wasn't able to prove his idea and provide evidence for this idea to support it, this theory is deemed a failure. Although Spearman wasn't able to prove his idea to be true, he did inspire the next theorists to create the theory of primary mental abilities. And this theory was created by L.L. Thurstone, which is the belief that we have 8 mental abilities that are independent from each other. During the original testing, there were 7 clusters of mental abilities, but now they've added an extra one. And these clusters are perceptual speed, numerical ability, verbal meaning, memory, spatial skills, reasoning, word fluency, and comprehension. And the one thing that supports L.L. Thurstone's theory is the Savant Syndrome. The Savant Syndrome is definitely a term I want y'all to study and make sure that you know because it's important to Chapter 10 and it's pretty much the one thing that helps to prove Thurstone's original idea. So the Savant Syndrome is the idea that you can have an issue with your mental abilities and still be great in different factors and functions. So although you have this issue with the way that your mind processes things, you're still able to be great in different abilities. Savant Syndrome just basically proves that you can be excellent in a number of different areas, no matter what's going on with the way that your brain processes information. So when it came to testing his theory, L.L. Thurstone took the time to analyze mental test data and samples from people with similar IQs. And what he found from this is that they had different profiles of primary mental abilities. And this further supported his model because it gave him the clinical data that he needed to support his theory. Unlike Spearman couldn't find enough evidence to support his theory, but the next test that L.L. Thurston did kind of gave a little bit of evidence for Spearmint. So the next test that L.L. Thurston did was a test on very intelligent children, and he found that he did not discover 7 primary abilities when it came to the children. He actually was able to find traces of evidence of the G factor. So Thurston managed to create like a mathematical solution that resolved these different contradictions in his results. But in the final version of his theory, he was able to like pretty much account for both the G factor and the 7 specific abilities. And it gave Spearmint a little bit more evidence for his theory. After all of the testing that L.L. Thurston did, he found that there was evidence of the primary mental abilities, but he also found that there was evidence of the G factor. And what this did was create an issue for his theory to be primary because he found traces of the G factor. So he tried to create a mathematical solution that would get rid of all of the contradictions or all of the traces of the G factor. But what that did was end up making his theory not good. It compromised his theory. So in the end, this whole little situation created the groundwork for Howard Gardner to create the theory of multiple intelligence. Although Thurston's theory is not considered the primary because of the evidence that he found of the G factor, it still inspired Howard Gardner to create the theory of multiple intelligence. So the next theory I want to talk about is the theory of multiple intelligence. And this was created by Howard Gardner. So honestly, Howard Gardner agreed with Thurston's theory that intellectual skills were independent of one another. So originally, there were 7 independent intelligences that Howard Gardner came up with, but they've recently added an 8th one. And they are logical, mathematical, spatial, linguistic, body kinesthetic, musical, interpersonal, and naturalist. So Howard Gardner believed that it was important to focus on more than just book sense when it came to defining what the independent intelligences were. So Howard Gardner believes that we are all able to know the world through language, through these different multiple intelligences. But the area where we change up or we differ is in the strength of these intelligences, the so-called profiles, and in the ways that we combine the information and carry out the different tasks, solve diverse problems, and progress in various domains. So basically, he's saying that we all have the ability to consume language and to do to consume what we need to consume, but it's the way that we do it that's different. And that's why we have all of these multiple intelligences. This theory raised the question, can everybody learn the same way? It actually challenged the education system because at that time, they were pretty much assuming that every kid learned the same way and that everyone was able to, I guess, become uniformed when it came to education. So this actual theory helped with challenging the education system. Howard Gardner believed that every person learns in a different type of way, especially when it comes to students. So he thought that it would be smart to teach kids in a different type of way that applied to their specific learning style. And at that time, the education system looked at education as a uniform thing. They wanted to do everything the same way for each student. So his theory challenged the system to make changes that will help accommodate the different types of learners. Howard's theory raised the question, how much weight do you place on intelligence versus talents and abilities? And his theory didn't have enough evidence to prove the answer to that question. So although his theory wasn't completely proven, he did lay the groundwork for another theorist to come through and try to prove more of his theory. So the next theory I want to talk about is the triarchic theory of intelligence. And this theory was created by Robert Sternberg. And Sternberg actually agreed with Gardner, but he changed it up a little bit. Sternberg believed that the way that intelligence was being measured was completely wrong. He believed that if we're going to measure intelligence, we have to take into account how it translates to the real world. So Sternberg made it a point to narrow down his intelligences to create a definition of what he believed would lead to real world success. He narrowed it down to 3 independent intelligences, and they are analytical, creative, and practical. Analytical is the problem-solving intelligence. It is easily assessed by intelligence tests, and it's easy to find a single right answer when it comes to analytical intelligence. It deals with critiquing and evaluating the situation. Now, the second one is creative intelligence, which is the ability to adapt to new situations. So you're able to invent, create, or discover new things and come up with a generative novel idea. The third thing is a practical intelligence, and this is what you use in your everyday tasks. So you're able to apply, utilize, and implement different things to solve a situation. Basically, what Sternberg is saying is an intelligent person will use all 3 of these specific intelligences to navigate throughout life and become successful. So if an individual is very skillful in a certain area, they're going to find ways to utilize these things to make that even greater and be successful in the world. If somebody is not very skillful in a certain area, they're going to use all 3 of these intelligences to find the resources and to better themselves. So the whole essence of this is being able to utilize analytical, creative, and practical intelligences to create an environment that pushes you to be more successful in the real world. Adapting and shaping your environment is really important when it comes to this theory because that's the premise of where you build your success or build your intelligence. This whole theory has to do with the way that we mentally process information and what we do afterwards, what action we put forth afterwards. It's basically how we plan out a situation, how we act on it, and how we basically use what we've learned to better ourselves in other areas. There are 3 terms that you may want to look up on your Quizlet. They are meta components, performance components, and knowledge acquisition components. These are 3 things that are mentioned with this theory. So I'll go ahead and define these. Meta components or executive processes enable a person to plan what to do, monitor things as they are being done, and evaluate things after they are done. Performance components execute the instructions of the meta components. And knowledge acquisition components are used to learn how to solve problems or acquire knowledge. I'm going to use the example of writing a paper to explain these different components. So an example of a meta component would be writing out a outline or a brief outline of how we're going to do the paper. So meta components have to do with the plan. The performance components has to do with exactly what that first word means. Performance means to act and to do. So when it comes to writing a paper, the performance component is the act of writing the paper. And then the last part is knowledge acquisition component. That is basically learning something new as you are actually writing the paper. So it's the act of consuming new information as you are writing the paper. So this theory encouraged multiple types of intelligence. So one of them would be emotional intelligence, and then the other one would be creativity. Sternberg says that we have some tests that look at creativity and the potential of creativity, but we don't have a standardized system for quantifying creativity. So basically, there aren't any specific tests that can test creativity. So as a result, Sternberg and his colleagues have developed 5 main components of creativity. And this helps us understand what creative potential is and how it works. So the first one is expertise. The second one is imaginative thinking skills. The third one is venturesome personality. The fourth one is intrinsic motivation. And the fifth one is creative environment. So expertise is knowing a lot about a lot of stuff. Is pretty much the way that we use data to help us understand things in new ways. And then imaginative thinking skills are the ability to see things in new ways, recognize patterns, and make connections. The third one, venturesome personality, is seeking new experiences, tolerating risks, and working to overcome obstacles. Intrinsic motivation is driven by interest in challenge. So you get pleasure from the work itself. And creative environment is where you benefit from a creative environment that sparks, supports, and redefines ideas. Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions. And this is defined by psychologist John Mayer. There are 4 different types. The first one is perceiving emotions, and that's being able to recognize them in faces and even music, film, and stories. The second is understanding emotions, and that's being able to predict them and how they might change. The third one is managing emotions, and that's knowing how to appropriately express yourself in various situations. And the fourth one is using emotions to enable adaptive or creative thinking. So an example of that would be resolving conflicts or comforting a friend that is crying or something like that. So these are other types of intelligence that spawned from the theory that Robert Sternberg created. This theory raised the question that emotional intelligence can be measured to some degree, but there's no standardized way of assigning a numerical value. So if we can't quantify emotional intelligence, how did we come up with a way to measure intelligence? And this sparked the next theory. The next theorist that I want to talk about is Sir Francis Galton, and he is responsible for eugenics. Sir Francis Galton believes that we could create a master race if 2 supreme families were to breed and create children that were considered born well. This whole theory is basically hereditary versus environment. The question is, are you born with intelligence and is it inherent? Like, did you get it from your parents or is it built in your environment? So Galton's mission is to find the answer to this question. And this led to all kinds of different tactics to try to figure this out. So this led people to believe that intelligence is inherited and it offers some sort of survival advantage. Like, it basically made people go completely crazy. People really started going overboard with trying to find ways to understand how intelligence was created or how to find ways to determine who is deemed more intelligent. People started to believe that if intelligence is inherited, there must be a way to measure intelligence in your body measurements. So this sparked the whole movement of trying to figure out what exactly does intelligent look like. They started to take measurements of things like the head size, reaction time, muscle power, sensory IQ, and body portions, just to try to determine what body type was considered more intelligent. The issue with this is that it kind of sparked the birth of the negative eugenics. So this caused people to start basically making marriage laws, and they started segregating. They started sterilization and euthanization. They also deemed criminals and people who had mental disorders as people who you shouldn't reproduce with. Like, they created a whole idea of who you shouldn't talk to or deal with based on this study or based on what Galton was trying to prove. So as a result of Sir Francis Galton and the things that he was studying, the French education system underwent a reform by the government that demanded that every student and every kid goes to mandatory school. The issue with this is all of the kids didn't attend school regularly, so only really the wealthy went to school. So this resulted in students being way below their education level that they should be at, and then some kids being way above the education level that they should be at. So the school system had to find a way to place these kids in the proper classroom so that they could learn the things they need to learn to catch up with their grade level. So this inspired Alfred Binet and Theodore Simone to create a testing system that would help figure out the mental age of the actual child and put them in the correct place where they needed to be in school so that they can learn properly. So the test that Alfred Binet and Theodore Simone created was the Binet-Simone test. And this test was basically a system that helped them assess the student so that they could properly place the kid in the right classroom. So it was a sorting device. And the equation for this test was mental age equals average performance over a particular age. So their mission was to basically figure out what the kid's mental age was so that they could place them in the correct type of classroom that would help them become better. They believed that intelligence wasn't a fixed inborn thing. They believed it wasn't hereditary. They believed that you could raise someone's intelligence by just paying very close attention, being self-disciplined, and actually practicing. Doing this test and this process really concerned Binet and Simone because they felt that this could cause kids to be labeled in a negative way. So if a kid didn't perform as good as their average, the average people that were in their class, they could be considered dumb or be placed in certain rooms that weren't going to help them become better. So Binet and Simone felt that if the kids were labeled negatively, they wouldn't have opportunities or they would be limited to the opportunities that they could have. So let me say this one more time. The equation for this specific test was mental age equals the average performance over the average performance of a particular age. So if you have a 6-year-old that you are testing and they got a particular score that is in line with the average scores that other 6-year-olds scored, they would be considered 6 years old. But if it was below what the average 6-year-olds scored, they would be considered lower than an actual 6-year-old. So their mental age would drop based on what they scored. And his goal was to enhance the education process by using the test to identify those who need help and attention. But he feared that this tool would be used in a horrible way if it was put in the wrong hands. The next test I want to talk about is IQ, the intelligence quotient, which was created by William Stern. So William Stern took some of Binet's work and recreated this system, and he called it the IQ, or the intelligence quotient. And the way that you get the results for your IQ is basically IQ equals mental age over chronological age multiplied by 100. Your goal is to make sure that your ratio is 100 by the end of the equation. So this equation works really well for kids, but for someone who is older, it doesn't work as well. Like, whenever your denominator gets even bigger, it automatically takes away from your numerator. So that automatically takes away from your ratio IQ. So instead of using this equation for older people, they created a new equation, which is deviation IQ. This equation is your average score over the score of your age range multiplied by 100. And that will give you your deviation IQ if you are an older individual. One thing you should know about IQ is that it does not measure performance. It measures the potential learning ability. So make sure you keep that in mind when you think about IQ. So an example of this would be comparing a 5-year-old with an IQ of 130 to a 19-year-old with an IQ of 90. Yes, the 5-year-old has a higher IQ, but that doesn't mean that he can do more than the 19-year-old. So This just proves that IQ does not measure what you can do, it's measuring your potential learning ability. The next test I want to talk about is the Stanford Binet intelligence scale. And this was created by Louis Terman, and he was highly influenced by the Binet Simone test, and he took some of the things that they did and combined it with his theories as well. So Terman is known for his longitudinal study that he did in 1921, where he tested 168,000 children. He ended up choosing 1,500 kids out of those students that scored 135 or higher on their tests. So he followed these kids throughout their lives to see if early childhood IQ could predict future performance in life. And his findings came to be that a relationship between early IQ prediction and success wasn't a guarantee, but he did find that those students had higher income jobs, they had higher education, they published a number of books and papers, and they held patents as well. So amongst the students that he tested and followed, they did show that they had a better way of living, or they had a better grade of life after they did that. So, but he was not able to prove that IQ could predict success, and it wasn't a guarantee. As a result of his longitudinal study, he was one of the first people to assist the U.S. government in the first mass administration of intelligence tests. So Terman used the numerical findings as a label in order to categorize these individuals. He believed that his test could ultimately result in getting rid of feeble-mindedness. And feeble-mindedness basically is someone that is stupid, or an overall group of people who are stupid or not smart. This sparked a huge eugenic movement in the U.S. So in the first half of the 20th century, intelligence tests were used to enforce sterilization of about 60,000 people. So that's 1/3 of the people that were in California. Like, they got rid of anybody that they felt was feeble-minded or stupid. And that kind of resulted in a lot of deaths in poor white women, unwed mothers, and prostitutes and things like that. They also said that poor African Americans, Native Americans, and Latino women were affected by this as well. So it's also said that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis loved eugenics. They took this intelligence testing to the dark side by selecting against feeble-mindedness and other undesirable traits. So they sterilized or simply executed hundreds of thousands of people based on the answers to the pseudo IQ test questions that they created. Their questions were focused on social norms instead of measuring actual intelligence. So basically, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis used this science to basically kill off anybody that didn't fit their form of intelligence or didn't fit into their idea of perfect. And this was the Holocaust. This created the Holocaust. Another test I want to talk about is the Ways test, which was created by David Wechsler in 1939. The Ways test is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And this test separates scores from verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, and processing speed. So striking differences among these scores can provide clues to cognitive strengths and weaknesses. So this test required an in-person test with a psychometrician assessment that requires a verbal response to general content, including general knowledge, memory, applying rules, explaining phrases, words, and meanings. The psychometrician will then assess your answers and create your score from there. So the Ways test also has different versions, which is the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and the WPPSI, which is the Wechsler Primary and Preschool Scale of Intelligence. The last thing I want to talk about is the principles of test construction. So you have standardization, normal curve, reliability, validity, content validity, and predictive validity. These are all terms that you need to know on this test, because I'm pretty sure your teacher is going to ask you about the principles of structuring a test. So standardization is defining uniform testing procedures and meaningful scores by comparison with the performance of a pre-tested group. Normal curve is the bell-shaped curve that describes the distribution of many physical and physiological attributes. Most scores fall near the average, and fewer scores lie near the extremes. Reliability is the extent to which a test yields consistent results, or as assessed by the consistency of scores on two halves of the test, on alternative forms of the test, or on retesting. Validity is the extent of which a test measures or predicts what it is supposed to and what it promises. And content validity is the extent to which a test samples the behavior that is of interest, and predictive validity is the success with which a test predicts the behavior it is designed to predict. It is assessed by computing the correlation between test scores and the criterion behavior. So, criterion-related validity. So as you can see, Chapter 10 is all about intelligence. It's about the theories that shape intelligence and the tests that basically measure intelligence. So you want to make sure that you understand each one of these theories and that you can associate the theory with the actual theorist or the psychologist. So my suggestion is that you create your own association just to help you remember what the key steps are to that specific theory, and also the name of the person who created the theory. So for me, I use G-Unit as the association to help me remember the theory of general intelligence. And the reason I use G-Unit is because it's something that I can remember, that I'm familiar with, and that I can use to remember that Charles Spearman created the G factor. So for an example, you could use something that you're very, very familiar with, that you're going to remember, and find ways to make it relate to that theory or that specific theorist. So make sure you create your own association so that you can remember what that theory does, the results of that theory, and who created it.